Hi, my name is Ben Kane. I'm here with the Jewish War Veterans of the United States of America. Today is October 27th, 2018, and I'm here with Mr. Isaac Shapiro. Mr. Shapiro has a very interesting upbringing in life, so we're going to start from the beginning. I'm just going to ask you a few questions. And if there's any, you also have a memoir that was released recently called Edoko, Growing Up a Stateless Foreigner in Wartime Japan. So that's where you can get more information on Mr. Isaac Shapiro.
It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
Excellent. So I guess we'll start from the beginning. When and where were you born?
I was born on January 5th, 1931 in Tokyo, Japan, at the Red Cross Hospital.
And where were your parents from?
My parents were both born in Russia, or each one, in different parts of Russia. My father was born in Saratov on the Volga River, where his father was a banker and was therefore allowed to live outside the Pale of Settlement. Volga was outside the Pale, Saratov was outside the Pale of Settlement. My mother, on the other hand, was born in Odessa, which was in Ukraine. It still is in Ukraine, and populated largely by Jews and Greeks, as well as Russians. And she left Odessa in 1905 after the big pogrom, where 1,000 people were killed. And her father took her at the age of 4 months to China, to Harbin, where she grew up. I grew up both in Harbin and Japan, because when I was about a year old, my mother separated from my father and took the four of us, we were 4 brothers, to the home of her father in Harbin, China, where we remained for 5 years, and then my parents were reunited in 1936, and we went back to Japan and stayed there.
And what was life like in China and Japan? Was there any kind of any anti-Semitism that you noticed growing up there? Were you kind of were there a lot of Jews in the area, or was it?
Well, there was no anti-Semitism in Japan that we ever experienced. There was anti-Semitism in Harbin because there was a large, especially after the revolution, a large non-Jewish Russian population, and they were not terribly friendly toward the Jews. Earlier on, from between about 1895 and 1918, after the Russian Revolution, there was a large Jewish population in Harbin, and very few non-Jewish Russians. They all came after the revolution. And so there was anti-Semitism in the Russian communities in China.
Right. Did you experience anything yourself?
Nothing that I recall. There was already a synagogue in Harbin, still is. It's now a Jewish museum, which the Chinese government operates, because there's no Jewish community there. But they preserved the synagogue. I've seen it. We were there in 2006. And it's very well maintained. And there is a Chinese organization dedicated to Jewish history of Harbin. It's called the Harbin Jewish History Association or something. It's operated by the Chinese government. So the Chinese government today is very conscious of the history of the Jews in China and dedicated to preserving that memory in a positive way.
Interesting. And then, so how did you get from Japan to the United States? What was going on?
We were living in in Tokyo, when the war ended in August 1945. And
what were the war years like for you and your family?
Well, initially, the main difficulty was food shortage. But then in 1944, The bombings began, the B-29 raids, General LeMay, and throughout the fall of 1944 and the spring of 1945, we were subjected to repeated bombings by B-29 airplanes that came at low altitudes and dropped firebombs. And most of Tokyo was destroyed by fire, and over 100,000 people were killed, more than in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki, interestingly enough. And so Tokyo was ruined, very much destroyed, and then started to rebuild after the war. When the war ended, I took it on myself. I was 14 years old. I wanted to see the American troops, so I told my parents I was going to the country to shop for food, which I wasn't. And I took the train down to Yokohama, went down to the port there where the troops were landing, and I was accosted by an American Army captain, Captain Kelly, who said, asked me if I spoke English and would I help him to communicate with his Japanese driver, as he was out looking for housing for senior officers, generals. And I knew the area where he was looking. It was an area of foreign settlement. Well-to-do foreigners who had gone during the war to the mountains to escape the bombings. And so their houses were empty. And I went around with Captain Kelly, and he said, he asked me how would I like to work for the Army. Took me to meet his commanding officer, and I was hired.
As a 14-year-old?
As a 14-year-old. And I said, well, I want to go home and tell my parents what's happened, and I'll come back. And on my way to the station to take the train back to Tokyo, I was picked up by 3 officers in a Jeep, a lieutenant, a Marine lieutenant, and 2 naval officers. And they said, oh, you don't want to work for the Army, come work for us. They took me down to their ship, which was in Yokosuka Harbor, and took me aboard the ship and dressed me in a sailor suit and told me to come back there and work for them. So I said, sure, I'd love to do that. And so I told the Army I wasn't coming. Went back to tell my parents about what had happened, and then returned to Yokosuka. And they weren't going to use me, actually, because their ship was sailing back to America. And so they turned me over to to a captain in the Navy who commanded the air base there. And he said to me that in 2 weeks, the air base would be taken over by a Marine Air Group, and that he knew the commanding officer very well, General Munn, Toby Munn. And when Toby Munn arrived, he introduced me, and Toby Munn befriended me, hired me, and eventually brought me to America in 1946 to live with him. He was married but had no children, and so I became his, what would you call it?
What?
A friend.
Friend.
And what did your parents think about your
Well, they were
career choice?
a little bit shocked, but life was not normal, and they were used to unexpected events, and so they didn't protest. And I didn't see them again until 1952, when I was in the U.S. Army and returned to Japan on my way to Korea, and it was the first time that I saw my parents after the war, right. They then went to California to live after the peace treaty was signed in '52, and they lived the rest of their lives in California until they died. And meanwhile, I spent 2 years in Hawaii, where Colonel Munn was stationed. And then I went from there in 1948 to Columbia College here in New York. Colonel Munn thought it would be a good place for me to go, New York City. And I've been more or less living in and out of New York ever since.
Right. So you went to college before you were deployed to...
I went to college for 2 years, from 48 to 50. And I had meanwhile enlisted in a U.S. Army Reserve unit before the Korean War started. And the purpose of it was that I could travel on military planes to visit Colonel Munn. He said to me, why don't you join some military unit, and then I can bring you to wherever I'm stationed on a naval aircraft, because you would put on your uniform. And neither one of us thought there would be a war. And a few months after that, the Korean War started, and he said, oh my God, what did I do to you? And I said, no, it's fine. And my unit was called up in 1950, and I went to Korea, spent 2 years in the Army, came back to Columbia, was back in Columbia College for 1 year before starting law school. Started law school in 1953. That's where I met my wife, who was a law student.
Did you have any kind of interest in joining the armed forces while you were living in Japan, or is this kind of...
No, not at all. And I actually tried to join the Naval ROTC at Columbia College, but the commanding officer didn't want to take me. He said, I'll never forget it, and he interviewed me, and he said, how do I know whether you're a white Ruski or a red Ruski? If you're a red Ruski, you're an enemy of America, so I'm not going to allow you to join the ROTC. I thought he was a little crazy.
Even though you didn't really spend too much time in Russia. And when you did finally enlist, did you experience any kind of anti-Semitism while you were
in
there?
the Army? Not at all.
Did they accept you?
Not at all. I had a very congenial time with my fellow soldiers, and in Korea we had a small unit, engineer technical intelligence team. There were 4 of us, 1 officer and 3 enlisted men. We slept in tents, of course, because we were on the front line. And I served 6 months in Korea before returning to New York.
So what was being in Korea? What was that experience like?
Well, our mission was to pick up and examine enemy mines and booby traps. So it was a somewhat risky mission, but we carried it out. And I also interviewed North Korean prisoners of war because I spoke Japanese. All the kids in Korea grew up learning Japanese until after the war, when Korea was returned to independence of the Japanese occupation ended, and the Korean schools stopped teaching Japanese. But in 1952, anyone who had been to elementary school before 1945 spoke Japanese. So I found that North Korean prisoners of war almost invariably spoke Japanese, and I could interrogate them, which I did. It was one of my duties.
And what was that like, interviewing these prisoners?
Well, they were quite submissive, not the least bit antagonistic. They were happy, actually, to be prisoners of the South Koreans to get away from North Korea.
And then, were you the only Jew that was in your unit?
Yes, we were only 4 of us. There was an officer, Lieutenant Knight, forgotten where he was from, but he had served in World War II. And there was a sergeant major, an older man, and a corporal, and I was a sergeant. And we were all very friendly toward each other, and there was no anti-Semitism at all in the unit.
Right. Were you a practicing Jew, or like before the war and
Well, I was
during, or
I would say certainly an open and acknowledging Jew. I acknowledged that I was Jewish. My father was very religious. There was no synagogue in Tokyo during the war, but my father observed the Sabbath, put on his yarmulke and said his prayers, and he observed the kosher laws. Although he had not grown up in Russia, exposed to very much to Judaism, but after the revolution, he escaped from Russia and went to Germany, and he spent 7, 8 years in Germany after the revolution until 1925. He met my mother there. She had meanwhile gone from Harbin to Berlin to study music, and he was a musician. They met and married, and they went for 2 years to Palestine. He'd become very Zionistic, and there were a lot of Jews who were leaving Europe and going to Palestine. It was a British mandate. My parents spent 2 years there. My mother had twins in 1926, and life was very difficult economically. And she said, she was pregnant with a third child. She said to my father, I want to go back to Harbin. So they left Palestine after 2 years, left in 1928. It was very difficult economically, especially for musicians. In my father's case, he told me that they received no salary when he played in the Tel Aviv Symphony Orchestra. They split the proceeds from the ticket sales. The orchestra had no money to pay them. So whatever they got in the way of ticket sales, that was what they received in the way of pay. But anyway, in 28 they went back to Harbin. My mother had a fourth son. My older brother lives in California. And then she had me in 1931. And in 1939 she had her fifth son, who was still alive, who was in Vermont.
did any of your siblings join the military or say
Yes,
anything about your
two of them.
service?
The twins. One joined the Soviet Army, and one joined the Israeli Air Force. And so the three of us were serving in 3 different military units. I was in the American Army. My oldest brother was in the Soviet Army, and his twin was in the Israeli Air Force. He had gone to Israel in 1949, after the creation of Israel. He left with a group of Jews who were leaving China and emigrating to Israel. And there was a Golda Meir was responsible for putting together the group and getting them a ship that went around the Cape of Good Hope. Couldn't go through the Suez Canal in 1949. Went around the Cape of Good Hope, and there were hundreds of Jews on the ship who were seeking to go to the newly created state of Israel. And he spent 10 years there before going to join my parents in California. 5 of them in the Israeli Air Force.
And did you have any interest in going to Israel at any point?
Well, we visited Israel, but twice. But I had no particular interest in moving there. I was happy in America. Good education in the college and law school at Columbia. And then I had a Fulbright to Paris. We were married just before we went to Paris. Stayed there for a year. And have worked in 2 different law firms over a 60-year period. 30 years at Milbank Tweed and became a partner there, and then left them to join Skadden Arps, where I've been for 32 years.
Right. So when you were living in Japan, did you have any interest in going to America, or was that not really a thought that crossed your mind?
Oh no,
Before?
it certainly did. We discussed it with my brothers, and diaries that we kept during the war indicate that we hoped one day to go to America. We certainly didn't want to go to Russia, and Israel didn't exist until 1948, so there was no discussion of moving to Israel. And we weren't interested in Europe. We were interested in England because our first school, elementary school, was a British school that gave a Cambridge certificate when you graduated. And so we thought, while we were at that school, that one day we'd be able to go to England. And my father had relatives that had left Russia during the Revolution and moved to England. He had an uncle there and a cousin. There was a kind of diaspora at the time of the Revolution, and members of the family moved all over the world. South Africa, where my father's mother eventually died, and his brother took her there, and Australia, America. And then when the war started and the British school closed, we moved to an American school, and then to a Japanese international school, and then no school. Towards the end of the war, we didn't go to school. So there was no incentive particularly to think about moving to England. And when the United States won the war and the occupation began, it was sort of everybody's dream to go to America.
And they just picked you out of the crowd? They just happened to see you?
Well, as I told you earlier, I bumped into first an American Army captain, and then became the ward of a Marine colonel who took me to America.
And you were in, when the Korean War broke out?
Yes, 1950. I was at Columbia College.
So you were in Korea for 6 months, you said?
6 months. No. I was discharged in July of '52. Sergeant.
So, in Korea, did you experience any first-hand combat, or were you mostly not doing the
Well, our mission was
to defuse landmines?
Our mission was not to shoot at the enemy, but to pick up mines and booby traps. It was dangerous enough.
Right. Were there any kind of incidents that happened either in combat or just in general in Korea that stood out to you?
Not really. It was not I didn't feel it was a particularly dangerous mission. And when my time was up, I went back to New York.
Were you able to communicate with any family members while you were in Korea, or were you just...
I made one, well, I stopped in Japan on the way to Korea early '52, and then I made one trip from Korea to Japan on a leave of absence to see my parents before they moved to California. And my older brother, who now, the other two have died, the twins, he just turned 90, he lives in Los Angeles. He continued to live in Japan for many years after my parents left. He married a Japanese woman, and now they live in Los Angeles.
When you returned from Korea, what was the atmosphere like towards service members, towards Jewish service members in particular? Was there any kind of acknowledgement, either positive or negative, towards?
Well, we had the GI Bill of Rights, which was a very generous program, subsidized education, and I mingled with other veterans at Columbia.
Hmm.
There were quite a number of us, and then eventually my enlistment expired, and I left the service, and have really had no particular connection with the Army
Right.
since then.
And so while you were in Korea, did you keep a diary then, and were there photographs taken of you? Was there any kind of documentation of your experiences there?
Well, in my office I have a photograph of my fellow soldiers and myself, but here I don't have. Do I have any pictures of
Oh,
myself?
probably, but you know, like
Yeah, I don't know where
photographs like this.
I did not keep a diary, no.
And did you keep in contact with the people that you served with, or did you all go your separate ways once the war
I
concluded?
did for a couple of years. In fact, there were two of my fellow servicemen at our wedding in '56. So for that 4-year period, from '52 when I was discharged to '56, I kept in contact with fellow soldiers who were New Yorkers and had returned to New York and been discharged from the service. And as I say, I remember two of them whom we invited to our wedding. But after that, I lost touch with them. After I left to go to Paris and studied, more or less started a new group of friends.
Did you ever talk about your wartime experiences with people after you ended your service?
Not particularly, because at both Columbia College and Columbia Law School, 75% or more of the students had no military experience or interest or service. And so there was no particular social group that included veterans.
Right. So you didn't join any veterans
I
organizations?
did not, no.
Did you want to, or were you fine with just kind of keeping your experiences to yourself for the most part?
I had no particular interest in joining veterans groups. Much later, and now, I joined and I'm still a member of the Korean War Veterans Association. Have you heard of them?
I've not heard of them, no.
No. It's called
Um,
my membership card. I can tell you what the name is. Here, Korean War Veterans Association.
And are you a member of Jewish war veterans?
No.
Would you like to be?
I didn't know they existed until,
What?
I didn't know the Jewish War Veterans Association existed until Chris Kelly
Yeah, we're trying to work on that.
told me that you wanted to interview me.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was the first time I've heard of it.
Right. And have you ever shared your story with family members or with schools, or?
I've been on a book reading tour for the last year through Chris Kelly, who's my publicist. This book was first published in 2009. I self-published iUniverse, and it was not a great success. Self-publishing turned out to be a disappointment. And then in 2017, through my brother on the West Coast, I met a book agent, a woman who had moved from Holland, a Jewish woman whose parents were Holocaust survivors, and she now lives in California. And she's a book agent, and she was very interested in my book. And so she published it with a fresh cover, and it's an edited version, but she's been very actively pushing it commercially, and she introduced me, no, she didn't, someone else did, to this publicist, Chris Kelly. And he has arranged for a series of interviews and book readings. I have one more book reading next week at Columbia Law School.
What was it like writing that book? Did it bring back
Oh yes, it was, I enjoyed doing it. It was based primarily on memory, as well as archives that I had. And I had my older brother vet it to be sure that I was not incorrectly remembering things. And he helped me, he edited it.
And this book covers your childhood up to beyond the Korean War?
Yes, it ends pretty much in 1948, and then there's an epilogue which describes what's happened to me after 1948, just in general. Colonial education, my legal experience, some of the friends that I reconnected with who had been my friends in Japan when I was growing up, and who ended up living in New York. I still am in touch with those that have survived.
Have you been to Japan or Korea since you left?
Both, yes. We've been to Korea together. My firm has an office in Seoul. I haven't visited the office, but we haven't been, it's been a long time since we were in Korea.
What? Excuse me.
You and I went to Korea, but it's quite a while ago.
Oh, a long time ago.
But we've been to Japan several
lived in
times.
Japan.
We lived in Japan from 1977 to 79 with our two daughters. Our son was in college, so he didn't join us.
Came to visit.
And it was, I was at Milbank Tweed, and we opened an office in Tokyo in 77. And I stayed there for 2 years, and then I was replaced by another partner. Came back. We had this apartment. We've been living here since 71, 40-some years, 48 years. And we rented it out for 2 years while we went to Japan.
Right. Maybe talk to your kids about your youth and your experiences
sure.
in Korea.
Lots of times.
Hmm.
And the two girls enjoyed their 2-year stay in Japan and saw a lot of places where I had been a child.
Hmm. And how did your experiences in Japan, being with the Army and then joining armed forces yourself, how did that kind of influence the way you think about the world and your life in general?
Well, I have a very strong feeling for the military, American military, and I'm a great supporter of veterans and their organizations. I'm not active in a social way in any veterans group here in New York, but I have a strong empathy for people who have served and share my experiences with those I meet who have had the same background. It's something that stays with you.
Have you been in the military?
No, I come from a military family, but I personally...
I see. Well, then you know that there's a special feeling that you have if you've had the experience. It's different from civilian life.
Right. How hard was it adjusting from military life to civilian life, going from the Korean War to...
It wasn't difficult at all. I reconnected with Columbia, students that I'd been in school with. And actually, my class had graduated before I got back in '52. I got re-registered at Columbia in the fall of '52. My class had graduated.
They didn't wait for you?
No, they didn't. I graduated. And I didn't graduate in any real sense because at that time they had what they called the professional option. After 3 years in the college, you could enroll in the law school. And you got your BA degree at the end of your first year of law school. So I took the professional option. Having lost 2 years in the Army, I wanted to catch up. And so I enrolled in the professional option, and after a third year in the college, instead of staying in the college and graduating with the class of '54, I enrolled in the law school. And while I got my degree in '54, I didn't participate in any graduation.
Are there any anecdotes from your service that kind of come to mind when you look back on those days? Any experiences with your fellow soldiers?
Oh gosh.
What was the question? I didn't hear that.
Any
In the
memories from my service days and my experience with fellow soldiers?
Oh, how could you forget those things?
Well, I'm just not thinking of them now.
Yeah, I know a lot of times when you're serving the military, there's these moments of humor amidst all of the
Absolutely.
the chaos and the
I had a
pain.
very congenial and friendly relationship with my fellow soldiers, and we sang songs together, we went out together, but that's all you're talking about 65 years ago, 66 years ago. It's very hard to, right now, when you ask me to think about something.
Right. And is there any topic of your life that we haven't discussed yet that you think shaped who you are today, either in Japan or in Korea, or in the U.S. afterwards?
Well, during the 60 years that I've been a member of the bar and served in 2 different law firms, I had a lot of very interesting experiences which took me a lot to Europe. We got to know Paris very well. I had 4 cousins, and my father's sister, their mother, was still alive when we first went there, so I got connected with my Russian cousins who had found refuge in France after the Russian Revolution. When my father married my mother and went to Palestine and China and Japan, my father's younger sister, had stayed in Paris, married a Russian, and had 4 children, 4 cousins whom we got to know.
And converted from Judaism.
She converted as a child of 12, and they were all Russian Orthodox. The 4 cousins have since passed away. The last one of them a year ago, and so we no longer have any living cousins in France. I mean, there are about 40 descendants, but they're all younger generation people, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and we don't have any contact with them. So my experience over the past 60 years has been primarily with Europe. I got to know Russia, had cases involving Russia, went back found it very interesting to visit Moscow, Petersburg, spent a lot of time in Kazakhstan working on some legal problems there. So I've had a very satisfactory and exciting experience throughout the world. I had cases involving China and Japan too, but mostly Europe. So it was a discovery because I'd never been to Europe as a child. First time was when we got married and sailed to Paris
Right.
in 1956.
So you weren't able to go on leave except to visit your parents while you were stationed in Korea? You were only able to leave Korea once or twice?
Yes, once.
Do you ever miss your days in the armed forces, or is that a chapter of your life that you
No, I don't miss it, and I didn't want to spend my life in the military. Never thought about that. I was happy to have served, but I had no interest in making a career of it. And my mentor, my person who brought me to America, Colonel Munn, never encouraged me to join the military. He was very supportive of my becoming a lawyer. We remained in very close contact. I was with him when he died in 1986. So for that entire period, from 46 to 86, 40 years, we were in very close touch with one another.
Interesting. So I believe that is everything. Is there anything that you wanted to add, or?
Can you think of anything I haven't talked about?
No, I think you've covered your life story very well.
Okay.
Well, excellent. Thank you a lot. Thank you for allowing us into your home and
Not at
to
all.
interview you. We appreciate it.